So we're going to be continuing our study in the book of Colossians. And before I get started, this kind of goes along with graduation. If we haven't met, my name is Nathan. I'm the student pastor. I'm also a math teacher at Springdale High School. And as a math teacher, you have to find this balance between math theory and math application. And it's funny because my background is in physics, math application, but I love to find the beauty in mathematics. And so I tend to focus a lot on the abstract, those things that are always true and have always existed and all that cool stuff. And I have to learn to look for signs of students checking out, right? Being done with the abstract. That glossed over look in their eye, the heaviness of their head, and that all too often asked question, when am I ever going to use this? So I have to restrain myself and not say, well, based on your test scores, you're not using it now, and pull it from the abstract down into something that's more applicable. And that's what we're going to do today. For the past 2 weeks, we've been in Colossians, which is this letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to an early church plant. So you can imagine not knowing a whole lot about the gospel and then getting this letter in the mail from somebody who knows. And in the last two chapters, we focused on two different things. In the first chapter, it's all about Christ's supremacy, that he's overall. And we see that in Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. If there was any doubt in this early church who the person of Christ was, Paul lays that all to rest in Colossians chapter 1. He's it. He's not just a great man. He's not just a moral teacher. He's God in flesh. He created all things and reconciled all things to himself through his blood. That's chapter 1. Then Paul reminds us that if Christ is supreme and he's reconciled everything, then there isn't anything else that needs to be done. And that's chapter 2, when we read, "And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink or with regard to festivals or a new moon or a Sabbath." Jesus paid it all. He didn't split the bill. Paul outlines some very, very deep theology for this early church, but Paul does a great job from taking us to the mountaintops of theology down into this application. So we can ask the question, Christ is supreme and his cross paid it all, so what now? Those are amazing ideas that we could easily take sermon after sermon after sermon talking about. But what now? And that brings us to Colossians chapter 3, what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to point out three things for that what now. Christ's supremacy on the cross brings about what? Colossians 3, verse 1. "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." So this lets us know that Christ's supremacy on the cross means that we have a change in our thinking. Have you guys ever learned something that completely changed the way you thought about the world? A little bit of information that changed your routine. Couldn't think the same way anymore. I'm about to share something like that with you. Maybe I shouldn't, but I am, to make the point. A study out of the University of Arizona in 2012 titled, "Why Your Cell Phone Has More Germs Than a Toilet," found out that your cell phone has more germs than a toilet. Think about that for a second. That thing that you hold up to your mouth, it's not a little bit either. It's like 5 times more. They also found that the average picnic table had more germs than, wait for it, the average porta potty. So, I'm going to have some Clorox wipes after service if you want to come and clean your phone up. Just make a whole group of it. You learn some information, it just changes the way that you think about the world. We see this in Genesis. There's a story of this man named Abram, and he has an experience with God that completely changes his life. God tells Abram to pack up everything and move. And Abram says, where? And God says, I'll let you know when you get there. And so because of this experience with God, Abram packs up everything and leaves everything he knows and travels to this land that he doesn't know about that God's promised. And the writer of the book of Hebrews talks about this change in thinking that Abraham experienced in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Paul urges us to set out of our mind all the things that have to do with earth and think of things above. You know, you've heard before, he's so heavenly minded, no earthly good. That's not what Paul is talking about right here. When we set our mind on things above, we become a corpse to things below. It's a little bit morbid. But what he's saying is when you're always thinking about eternity, when your mind is set on eternity, your dead body doesn't have the appetites and desires that it had before. Right? The things that make you happy and find your affection, they just change because those things are above. Our head is there, our home is there, our treasure is there, and we hope to be there forever. So it changes the way that we think. And that brings us to the second thing. Christ's supremacy on the cross brings something else out in our life. We find that in Colossians 3, verse 5. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked when you were living in them, but now you must put them all away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Things get a little bit morbid, but Christ's supremacy on the cross causes a change in our behavior. Paul writes about it in his letter to the Galatians. He says, we're crucified with Christ, and yet we're still alive because it's not us that's living, it's Christ living in us. And it changes the way that we act. He also writes in his letter to the Philippians that Christ has started a work in you. This is just the beginning, and he's working it out. So when the cross changes our thinking, it changes our perspective, we can't help but act differently. And it plays out in 2 ways. So I said before, a corpse doesn't have appetites, it doesn't have desires, so it's going to throw off all of this old stuff. And this list is a list that shows up in a lot of Paul's letters. And I think some of the words kind of lose its meaning in the modern vernacular, and so we're going to read it from the paraphrase, the Message paraphrase. Same passage. And that means killing off everything connected with that way of death. Sexual promiscuity, impurity, lust, doing whatever you feel like whenever you feel like it, and grabbing whatever attracts your fancy. That's a life shaped by things and feelings instead of by God. It's because of this kind of thinking that God is about to explode in anger. It wasn't long ago that you were doing all that stuff and not knowing any better, but you know better now. So make sure it's all gone for good. Bad temper, irritability, meanness, profanity, dirty talking. Don't lie to one another. You're done with that old life. It's like a filthy set of ill-fitted clothes you've stripped off and put in the fire. Now you're dressed in a new wardrobe. Every item of your new way of life is custom made by the Creator with His label on it. All the old fashions are now obsolete. What Paul's saying is all that stuff, that's who you used to be. The writer of the Proverbs mentions, and then this is restated in 2 Peter, that as a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool to his folly. We know how disgusting it is. Don't go back to all that stuff. All that stuff is part of your used to be, not part of your now. So, I know that I'm making it sound easy, and in reality, it's not. Because we're left with something. Paul is relating this old self and our old used-to-be habits to like a worn-out, dusty, smelly, so 5 minutes ago coat. And when Christ dies, we take that off, right? We get to throw that away. But we're still left with the flesh, this part of us that's selfish, that wants to do its own thing, wants to act against God, and it reminds us of how good we used to look in that coat. And it says, you might as well try it on, see if it still fits. When we throw it in the trash, it's pulling it back out, hanging it in the closet. And so we're warring against this desire to do the things that we want to do, our flesh wants to do. And thankfully, Paul outlines the best way to get rid of that old coat, and that's to put a new one on. We find that in Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 11. Put on then as God's chosen one, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if one has a complaint against another, forgive each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your heart, to which indeed you are called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your heart to God. My last sermon touched on this very passage. We were in the Church Bod series, and I talked about bear with one another. Is the same verse. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to mention this idea of putting on a new coat, putting on the new self. See, Jesus gives us the power to change, and he gives us the desire to change, and then we have to take the time to change. We have to work out our salvation, putting on that new coat. And like anything that's worth doing, it has to come with practice. We've got to practice it. Do you guys remember the story of Captain Sullenberger? It's been a few years now. They made a movie. We did it in reel to reel, I think in 2017, so it's been a little while. But he's the captain of the airplane who landed in the Hudson River. Didn't lose a single life. Miraculously landed in the Hudson River. The theologian N.T. Wright uses him as an illustration of what it looks like to develop this Christian character, this Christian virtue, this changing in our actions. In his book titled After You Believe, Why Christian Character Matters. So Captain Sullenberger did something that was not his first nature. I know it wasn't his first nature because it's not my first nature. It's not your first nature. We could not have landed that plane. I mean, I couldn't have taken it off, but let alone landed it. No, Sullenberger he made that landing because he had spent most of his life preparing for that moment. He had been a pilot for over 30 years, but not just that, he had practiced and taught specifically what to do in these kind of emergency situations. So when this crisis arose, he wasn't reaching for the manual. His second nature took over. Not his first, what he was created to do, but his second nature. Just like it was his first. And then his whole life had prepared him for that one moment. The writer N.T. Wright puts it this way in his book. Sully didn't have time to think. He had done all the work over the previous 30 years. And that's the thing about virtue, which I think society really hasn't caught on to. And he focuses on one virtue. Courage is not rushing off into battle, having had a stiff drink and waving a sword around and yelling some great whoop. Any fool could do that. Courage is what happens when you make 1,000 small decisions to put someone else's safety ahead of your own. Some of those decisions may be a bit difficult, but you get used to doing that, and then suddenly there is a major crisis. And without thinking, you automatically put other people's safety ahead of your own. That's the point of virtue. See, this is something that Captain Sullenberger had practiced his whole life. God had given him the ability to know how to do it and the desire to learn those skills, but he put into practice that change in action. We even read in this passage in Colossians, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in wisdom. Paul is telling us we have to learn it, and we have to teach it. And the only way that we can learn it is if the word of Christ lives in us. So if you don't have a Bible, I want to make sure that you leave today with one. So just come find me after the service, and I'll hook you up. You also need an opportunity in your life, besides just learning, but also sharing the things that you learned. And so if you don't have a group or another person that you can talk to about the things that you find in Scripture, Stuart Hawkins' contact information is in the program. And he's our small group ministry leader. And you contact him, and he'll get you involved in a group so that we can learn and we can share and we can work out this Christianity together. We can put on this new coat. So Christ's supremacy on the cross has caused a change in our thinking and a change in our behavior, and that brings us to the last area. Paul has slowly stepped us down from the abstract to the practical. He's stepped us from theology to thinking, from thinking to acting, and this last one is from acting to interacting. Chapter 3, verse 17. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Bondservants, obey everything, those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So we see this final part of the passage. Christ's supremacy on the cross has caused a change in our relationships. So I feel like we've already just rushed through this letter to the Colossians, and we've even rushed more through this chapter, and this section could be talked about for weeks and weeks. But I want to focus on just a few things. One, Paul highlights 6 relationships here, and in that culture, those would be the 6 foundational relationships: a husband and wife, a parent and child, a master and servant. Culturally, we're a little bit separated from master and servant, even though sometimes you feel like a slave at work, but understand it as employee, employer. As we become more like Christ, as we look more like the person who brought us reconciliation, it changes these relationships we have in our life. And they all exist in pairs. And you'll notice the commands that are given here don't come with stipulations. It doesn't say, wives, submit to your husband unless his idea is stupid. Wives, submit to your husband unless you have a better one. Submit to your husband unless he never takes charge. There are no stipulations. It's same with the husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Don't treat them harshly. Not unless she's cold sometimes or unless you stop feeling it. See, to Paul and the Hebrews, love wasn't a feeling anyway. It's mentioned all throughout this passage. It's an action. It's something that you have to work on. All of this is something you have to work on. I was at Autumn and Wilson's wedding yesterday. Beautiful wedding, even in spite of the rain. But the guy who officiated the wedding said something that I thought was so powerful. He turned to Wilson and he commended Wilson to fight for his marriage. When things get tough, to continue working on it. Because it doesn't stay easy forever. That's true for every relationship that we have in life. It's something that we're supposed to work on. In response to this supremacy, in response to this gift of salvation. And then he turned to Wilson and said, and you've got it in you. Christ gives us the ability to change and the desire to change, and then we get to work it out in our life. And I think it sums it up pretty well. You could talk about all the nuances of these relationship pairs, but I think what Paul is getting at is a step away from the golden rule. I know that sounds crazy, but don't treat people like you want to be treated. Treat people like God has treated you. Because Christ's supremacy on the cross changes the way that we think. It changes the way that we act. And it changes our relationships. Let's pray.